you know, the two great events in the early part of the 18th century, at least for the Oblates and our founder, St. Eugene, was first the French Revolution, which was world-shaking even today, and secondly it was the Napoleonic Wars, which went on year after year, straight after the finish of the French Revolution. How did they actually affect us in our work? Well, they left a huge desolation among the people, great poverty, misery, and so forth. And in that context, Eugene decided to found a group of fellow missionaries to proclaim the gospel again to the people of France, especially the most abandoned and the poor, people like the prisoners, the serfs, and so forth. And that would have had a great deal to do with the kind of preaching he did. I wonder what we would be like had we been born in a different era. Would we say the same things and preach the same things? The core of Eugene's life was his desire to serve the poor, the uneducated, those at least to offer society in many ways. He did that by opting to preach in the local dialect, totally unheard of. But he wanted to make sure he got to the most abandoned people in society. He went out to the villages and small towns and spoke to the ordinary people. He hadn't much time, oddly enough, for the better off or the wealthy or the privileged. His function was, he felt, to find the most abandoned people and to speak to them in the way they would understand. Eugene proposed a form of preaching for his followers which was full of the compassion of God. Forgiveness was part of life. You had to know your own dignity, had to proclaim to the most abandoned of people the dignity they held in the eyes of God. It was to be a joyful proclamation of the mystery of God's love for each one. In that respect, the Oblates were quite unusual. They were there as it were heralds of good news, and the good news was for everybody. It was a case of being kind and compassionate and understanding and know the value of each person in the eyes of God. This they proclaimed from the very first days. Eugene made a famous comment speaking on his first big sermon. He said to the people, "Be aware of the dignity you hold in the eyes of God." He spoke to the servants and the serfs and the abandoned of their dignity in the eyes of God. He lifted them up and gave them a sense of hope and a sense of joy. I'd like to think that Oblates today carry on that tradition. It was drummed into us by Eugene, into his young priests going on to foreign missions in the 1840s and 1850s and onwards. They were to know why they went. They went as heralds of hope to bring the good news to everybody. I'd like to think at this day and age, we Oblates are still heralds of hope. We should be speaking to our people with all the compassion and kindness and love of God, and they should know how important they are in the eyes of God. The forgiveness of God is there for all of us, not for the one or the two, the select, but for all of us. May we live in the joy of knowing everybody makes mistakes, and Jesus forgives us, everyone, in our own particular way. May we live in the glory of knowing we're proclaimers of the positive love of God, and everybody is worthy of God's forgiveness, peace,